Good morning. So I'm a little tired. My daughter, who lives here in Oakland with my granddaughter, gave me a birthday present. And the birthday present was to go see this little kid that first time I saw him, he's 11 years old. He's now not 11. And he kept me up really late, so I got back home around 2 o'clock. And this little kid, you probably know him, we used to call him Little Stevie Wonder. But it was an amazing show. And, just to give you a sense, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and it's a pleasure to work and get to know Tony. But I got an email last night from my high school English teacher. We're in contact, and it's been a long time since I've been in high school. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit, trying to give you a context, a structure, some concepts. And some of you may have already heard of these concepts. But even for those of you who have, hopefully I will be able to share something with you that will go a little deeper. And the heart of it is targeted universalism, but I'll also be talking about structures and why targeted universalism is so important. So we have the next slide. So first of all, these are the three concepts or four concepts I'm going to be laying out. Targeted universalism, how structures of opportunity affect our outcomes. What I call the circle of humanity, which is basically, do we create an empathetic space where we can be vulnerable and respectful and challenge each other, but not forget, and at a conscious or unconscious level, that we are deeply connected as human beings. And then talking about making transformation. Tony already talked about the systems changes that you need to sort of embrace, which is sort of hard because we sort of sometimes just sort of focus at the individual level, which is important but not sufficient. The next one. So one thing is this is a different paradigm. It's a simple paradigm, but it's a nuanced paradigm at the same time. And what it suggests is that universal strategies, programs, and targeted programs don't work. And they don't work for different reasons. And universal programs tend not to work, in part because oftentimes they're false universalities. They purport to be about something that they're not. And they actually focus oftentimes on strategies. So we have universal strategies. Everybody's going to get the same thing. And it ignores what I call our situatedness. It ignores how we are situated differently in relationship to structures, systems, opportunity. A very, very simple idea, but it's actually quite powerful. And so there's something positive about universal. You know, we all want to be connected. I already talked about in terms of our humanity. And we are connected. But we're connected in different ways. It's not an even connection. Obvious example, you work with children. Children are not just little adults. They actually are in a different life phase. So universal, as powerful as the idea is, universal strategies is actually false. When we think of culture, we start to begin to see this. I don't know how many of you watched any of the Olympics? Okay, so I watched some too. You know, it's sort of amazing, some amazing athletes. And I wondered how the athletes from the Middle East who were observing Ramadan, how they were doing. And I was thinking, you know what, if they were organizing these Olympics, they would never be doing Ramadan. No one thought of that. No one said, you know, let's get a little advantage over all the people who are going to be not eating all day. So a lot of time these, and again, that just looks like a universal thing. Everybody's in the same position, except they're not. The people who are not eating for 18 hours a day, trying to compete against the best athletes in the world, is at a disadvantage. And that's the way these sort of false universals work. It ignores, it ignores our situatedness. It ignores the fact that some of us might be Muslims, some of us might be Hindus, some of us might be whatever. And without thinking, without trying, without planning, excuse me, thank you, we disadvantage some people in relationship to the others. I travel a lot, and I experience this a lot when I travel. I get on a plane and I think, who designed these planes? You know, the person must have been 5'2". And again, I'm sure no one said, let's screw this guy who's 6'4". He'll never walk again. Again, it looks like a plane is just a universal thing. You get on it, though, and it's extremely differential in terms of how it distributes outcomes. I'm now at Berkeley. I was at Ohio State. When I first went to Ohio State, again, they had a rule that when you travel, you had to rent a compact. And I said, no. And I'm raising money. I was raising money for my own program. But they said, this is the rule. We treat everybody the same. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not riding in a compact. And then, so some people, Professor Powell, he's a prima donna. He won't ride in a compact. And so again, the impulse is right, but oftentimes when we do universal things, we're ignoring people's situatedness. So, next one. So what's wrong with just working on targeted strategies? So we recognize that people are situated differently. What's wrong with just targeting the people who are struggling or people who are not getting what we want them to get? Tony talked about African American males, for example. Why can't we just target them? Well, targeted strategies don't work either. And part of it's political and part of it's just empirical. I've done a lot of empirical research as well as others. And when we look at strategies that are just targeted, they almost never work. One reason, political reason, is that a group oftentimes is disadvantaged in relationship to the larger culture. And when you just focus on that group, you get those people, and oftentimes it's expressed as those people, want something special. We gave everybody the same thing, and now those people think they need something special. And it becomes politically divisive. Why are you focusing on African American males? What about Latino males? What about women? What about whites? What about? And there's an answer to that on one level, but we never get to actually seriously engage the question. Just take things like Prop 209. There's a sense of, what about me? You're caring about somebody else's child. What about my child? My child deserves something too. So when Tony talked about thriving children, he made it clear, this is for all the children, not just for struggling children. And so we know that when you just focus on a targeted group, especially when the group is marginalized, even if people don't say it, they quietly walk away. Okay, so we're doing that Native American thing again, but what about my kid? So targeted strategies don't have the political juice to actually be sustainable. So we can't really focus just on universal strategies or targeted strategies. We have to focus on both. We have to focus on what I call targeted universalism. What's universal is the goal. We all want positive outcomes for our children. Everybody wants that. The strategy is what's targeted. The goal is universal. The strategy is targeted. And the universal goal is not simply getting what the majority culture or the dominant culture has. So it's not, we all want what white people have. That's not really universal. First of all, we don't know what white people have. And some of the stuff they have, I don't want. So we have to be clear about a vision of where we all want to go. And Tony has set out a very important vision for Oakland and for the Oakland schools. And it's important for people to both buy into it, push back, have some discussion around it. But once you embrace it, it's for everybody. It's not for black kids, it's not for white kids, it's not for boys, it's for everybody. But because people are situated differently, the pathway of getting there will necessarily be different. So that's the heart of targeted universalism. So the heart of universalism, targeted universalism, is based on our situatedness within these structures, that we understand how we're situated differently. That's important on so many levels. Sometimes when we know our own situation, nobody knows the trouble I've seen, we actually separate ourselves from other people. We are all unique, but none of us are completely distinct. We all have experiences, but we all share a commonality. And sometimes we emphasize the commonality and want to ignore our uniqueness. But sometimes we emphasize the uniqueness and want to ignore our commonality. And sometimes when we embrace our uniqueness, we do it in a way that cuts us off from other people. It's like I say, you know, I'm sure that most of you don't have any clue what it's like to be a 60-something-year-old African-American, 6'4", balding man. Anybody have that experience? I'll tell you, it's a pretty amazing odds. You know, there's always one in the crowd. So it is a unique experience, right? But it's not an experience that's so unique that it cuts me off from all of you. So we both have to embrace our uniqueness and our commonality at the same time. And we do it in part by deepening our understanding of our situatedness. So this is just an illustration. Come to the next one. Of what I've been talking about. So the universal goal is to get everyone to the 3rd floor. And so we build an escalator to help people get to the 3rd floor. And then here comes someone in a wheelchair. The escalator doesn't work for that person. That person wants to get to the 3rd floor as well. That person wants the same universal goal. But because of the way that person is situated, the strategy can't be the same. That person needs an elevator. And we might say, well, you know, here comes that guy in a wheelchair. He thinks he's special. Everybody else gets on the escalator. He wants an elevator. Or we could even go further and say, okay, the poor guy in a wheelchair, he needs to get to the 3rd floor. We have an escalator. What we're going to do is get this guy some artificial limbs, a couple of crutches, stand him up and say good luck. Put him on the escalator. We can organize fixing the guy, right? We're not acknowledging that the structure, and all structures carry with them certain values. They benefit some more than others. They're more responsive to some more than others. And so part of our insight, when we see that the escalator is more responsive to people who are ambulatory, we can say, we're going to make you ambulatory too. We're going to fix you, not the system. So all the focus becomes, how do we fix African-American boys? Not how do we fix the system that impacts African-American boys. And of course, the obvious thing is you have to do both. But if you look at, for example, I've looked at many African-American male programs around the country, and I'd say 90% of them, and these are people with good intentions, the entire focus is, let's fix these boys, right? Take off that hoodie, pull your pants up, you know, look me in the eye, put on a tie. And I'm not saying that's unimportant. I have 2 boys myself. And yes, I tell them, pull your pants up, you know, but I also know that the system is problematic. So when my oldest son started to drive, he wanted to get a cell phone. And I'm a researcher, so I researched black man and cell phone. It's an ugly picture. When my son was a kid, there had been literally dozens of shootings of young black men by the police when they got ready to pick up their cell phone. Not one white man had been shot picking up their cell phone. And I don't think it's simply the police are racist. You know, I think, you know, they confront a black kid, a black young, they don't see him as a kid, first of all. They see him as a dangerous man. And he's getting ready to pick up, I swear he had a gun. So I said to my son, you can't get a cell phone, right? So I'm fixing my son. And my son was appropriately pissed. It's like, why can't I get a cell phone? But I had to try to keep him alive. At the same time, can we change that so that when a black man picks up a cell phone, he doesn't accidentally get shot? So you have to work on both things, not just tell my son he can't get a cell phone. How do I actually also change the system so that he's not exposed in this way? Next one. So what are we situated in? Next one. We're situated within structures. For example, you not only have your children in classrooms, they're also in neighborhoods, and all of these things impact their ability to learn. All these things impact their ability to thrive. And you know that. You know, years ago, when they said, okay, kids coming to school hungry, the first response was, well, you know, that's not my job. I'm not a cook. I'm not a chef. I'm a teacher. I'm an educator. But eventually, the school system took that on, saying kids showing up at school hungry can't learn. So you actually changed the system. You could actually flip that around and say, okay, we're going to send notes home to the parents saying, don't send your kid to school hungry, right? That's one approach, and it's a reasonable approach, except for many parents, they wouldn't have the capacity to actually respond to that. They don't deliberately send the kids to school hungry. So part of the thing is that understanding what your kids are situated in. And different kids are situated in different things. Some kids come to school very well fed. Some kids come to school hungry. You want both sets of children to learn. How do you do that? Feed the kids that don't have food. And in schools where a lot of kids don't have schools, instead of singling out the kids and saying, all right, how many of you didn't eat breakfast this morning? Right? And then the kids become stigmatized and become racialized. You don't say, all the black kids and Latino kids, raise your hand. You say, how many kids didn't eat this morning? And the vast majority of them will be black and Latino. It's a racialized thing, a system over here that's impacting your school environment over here. You have to figure out a way of responding to that. And so what some creative schools did was say, everybody gets free and reduced lunch. Everybody gets a morning breakfast. We're not going to designate kids. But it's hard because in an environment of scarce resources, your resource provider would say, wait a minute, some of those kids aren't eligible. But you know, as an educator, it's better to sort of engage the whole school. So these are some of the things that we pay attention to when we pay attention to targeted universalism. The next one. And again, you have 3 people out on a boat, and you say, we need to rescue 3 sets of people. We need to rescue those people. And we're going to send the ship out. It'll get there in 6 hours. Next one. And then you find out that some people, yeah, they're in an ocean liner, and the ocean liner is adrift, doesn't have any. 6 hours is not a problem. I mean, they may be irritated, sitting 6 hours in the ocean, not going anywhere, but the person in the inner tube is going to be dead in 6 hours. Again, the goal is the same, universal. How do we rescue people stranded in the ocean? The strategy has to actually be targeted based on their situatedness. They're situated differently within the ocean. Next one. And you all know, and this is a real picture, you all know, and we like the idea, we like the concept, because we don't want to be unfair to people, that a rising tide lifts all boats. Next one. Except, if you don't have a boat, rising tide, man, he's drowning. Actually, the guy in the boat's not doing too well either. But the sentiment, which is very powerful in our culture, the rising tide, this is universal strategy that affects all of us, is so powerful, and yet it's so wrong. And you hear this over and over again. I work with the White House and administration, with Congress, and I argue with them around this, and they sometimes get it and they lose it, and it's politically useful to sort of say, we're doing something for everybody, we're doing the same thing for everybody, but not everybody's in the same boat. And so targeted universalism then is both a communication strategy, it informs how we should talk about these issues, and it's also a programmatic strategy. It also tells us how we should design programs. So it's actually both of those things at the same time. Next one. And again, looking at any health or employment or any major effort that we're engaged in, and we can see that people are situated differently. And it's racially coded. And that's why I talk about racialization. It's not necessarily racism, it's racially coded. There may be some racial practice over here that shows up over here. And as Tony said, how do we interrupt it? Even if we didn't cause it, how do we interrupt it? We didn't cause the kid to come to school hungry. But that's not an excuse to turn our back on it and say, we're not going to do anything about it because we didn't cause it. We want to engage the kid where they are, engage the family where they are. Next one. Next one. So that means paying attention to structures and systems. Now, there are some common mistakes. And one common mistake is what's called methodological individualism, is that we see everything in terms of the individual. We don't even see structures. We don't see how people are being impacted by what we call opportunity structures. So we can actually map out, and we do, and we've actually done it for Oakland, and the Oakland School District has done this a lot as well. You can take multiple indicators and map them out spatially and also socially. And then you can look at populations in relationship to those indicators. And just like the slide that Tony showed you earlier in terms of, if I know someone's zip code, I can tell you with a certain degree of accuracy how long that person will live. Nothing else, I need to know nothing else about the person. It's not the person's eating habits. And so there's certain, a friend of mine, Manuel Pastor, he's done a mapping in terms of environmental hazards. Where is the most toxic air? Where are the particulates? And it's a very high correlation in our society that where toxic dumps are, where landfills are, is where the Black and Latino community is. And whether someone planned it that way or not. So we have our kids breathing particulates. Again, you could say, let's give all the kids gas masks. Let's fix the kids. Or you could say, no, there's a system that's actually doing something that can't be explained at the individual level. So part of our thing is to move beyond what we call methodological individualism. Just think, if you change your behavior, you would be fine. If you change your eating habits, you would be fine. And this is not to take away agency from the kid or from individuals. Individuals are important, but individuals always exist in relationship not only to other individuals, but to structures and systems. And so we have to hold all those things at the same time. And the next one. So geography matters. Structures matters. And relationships matter. So one thing about structures, when you look at multiple institutions, multiple indicators, you're looking at them not in an additive way. You're not looking at this thing over here and this. You're looking at these things in relationship to each other. And this relationship is dynamic. And so part of structures and systems is to understand the dynamic relationship between these various indicators. And that's both challenging and rewarding if we do it right. It's challenging because it's hard to hold multiple things at once. It's hard to see the dynamism of these multiple things. They say, is it race or is it class? And I always say it's like certs. It's two mints in one. It's both of them. It's hard for us to hold that. Well, is it candy mint or breath mint? It's both. And so those are, we're not taught that in the academy. It's like, let's look for the cause. And it's only now that we're getting into more sophisticated systems thinking that we realize there is not cause. There are multiple causes and they're interactive. That drives the researcher crazy. But the good news is, if we can identify the strategic glue, we can actually engage one or two things and it will impact other things in the system. It's tricky to find them. It's a complicated thing, but that's what we're looking for, those strategic interventions. So look for the relationship between things, not just things themselves. And then, what's our story? The story we tell matters a lot, and if I had time, I could take you through some of that. How we think about things, how we talk about things, has huge impacts on us individually and collectively. All the stuff coming out of the mind science in terms of how people are affected at an unconscious level. So someone may not be aware that the stories that they hear, the images that they see, impact how they behave. And I'll tell you just one story, because it's just such a powerful example. A friend of mine who's was head of the psych department at Stanford, he's now the dean of education at Stanford, Claude Steele. Some of you may know his work. So he does something called stereotype threat. And in that, what he does, and he's written this in a book called Whistling Vivaldi. So he has some Asian American women, graduate students, and he brings them into a room and he says, it's so wonderful to teach at Stanford because there's so many bright women. And then 15 minutes later, he gives them a math test, and they bomb the test. From the same group, same cohorts, women with exactly the same ability, he brings in the second group. In the second group, he says, it's so wonderful to teach at Stanford because there's so many bright Asian Americans. 15 minutes later, he gives them exactly the same test. They ace it. Both groups have exactly the same ability. The first group failed the test. The second group passed the test. Now, they've done this with Asian Americans. They've done it with blacks. They've done it with men. So every group, he calls it a stereotype threat. So can anyone have any clue why the first group failed the test and the second group passed it if they have exactly the same ability and it's the same test? Yes?
The belief system of the instructor. So the instructor believes one group would be successful and one group not.
Okay, so for those of you who didn't hear, she said it's the belief of the instructor that determined how the students perform. That's actually a very smart answer, but it's not correct. I'll take one in the back. Expectations? Okay, expectations, that's close. Wait, one more, yes.
Asians are good at math.
Asians are good at math, okay. It's called stereotype threat, so that's close. So what's going on is that all of us carry what we call neural networks. And one neural network can be activated over another. So when he says women, the neural networks that's activated is womanness. Their salient identity becomes their womanness. And they, not necessarily the instructor, they carry the stereotype because it's in our society that women are not good at math. So once they start organizing around their woman's identity, all this is at an unconscious level, they then perform consistent with what society expects women to do. Women are not supposed to be good at math. They're reminded that they're women, and then they bomb. And the second one, Asian Americans are supposed to be good at math. So once that becomes a salient identity, they perform consistent with that stereotype, and they perform well at math. And it's called priming. We are primed literally thousands of times a day. And there's actually a similar thing with African Americans where they remind students of their race, and then they give them a test. The African Americans' performance go down because they know that African Americans are not supposed to be good at tests. So once they're reminded of being African Americans, their performance go down. In a second example, their race is also highlighted, but this time they're connected to their community, and they're asked, what does their community expect you to do when you go to college? Again, a different set of networks get primed, and in this case, the performance between blacks and whites actually is cut in half just by asking them the question, what does your community expect you to do when you go to college? They're primed to actually perform, and they do perform. So my point is that the stories we tell actually prime us. The images that we see prime us at an unconscious level. We're not aware of it. And so at some point I'd like to have a chance to talk to you more about this because society is constantly priming us to do, perform, and not perform, and it affects our unconscious. So Disparities matter, but I want to suggest to you in the framework of targeted universalism, the question is how they matter and how we use them. So first of all, the universal goal is not to close disparities. The universal goal is to, so take an example. If you say 70% of whites, and these numbers are about right, 70% of whites have comprehensive health care insurance. Only about 45%, 40% of Latinos have comprehensive health insurance. For Native Americans, it's in the 20s. So you could say the goal is to close that disparity. Well, there are a number of ways of closing disparity. First of all, you could say, okay, we need to kick some white people off of health care. You know, that'll get everybody down to the same level. That's closing the disparity, right? Or you could say we want to get everybody to 70%. But really, we want to get everybody to 100%. And so the move for whites then is 30%. The move for blacks is 55%. And the pathway will be different for those. So the goal is not simply reducing the disparities. If you actually get everyone to the universal goal, you've actually dealt with disparities. So you have to, and disparities are important. Disparity tells you something about the system. It tells you that there's a problem in the system. It tells you where to dive more deeply. But the goal is not, the universal goal is not simply to reduce the disparities, that normalize what whites have. It turns out actually, and this is empirical data, turns out actually to be very divisive if you don't contextualize issues around disparities. Again, and for those of us who care about these issues around equity, oftentimes we just focus on disparities. Huge mistake. It doesn't mean that we don't care about disparities. It doesn't mean that we don't talk about disparities, but we talk about them in a different way. We think about them in a different way. Next one. And when disparities are durable, that is, if you see the same group always on the negative end of disparities, it tells you a great deal. It tells you that something is going on where you have durable categories and durable inequality. Next one. So this is just some data. You have this data. I won't linger on it. I'm going to try to wrap up in the next few minutes. And I have still a number of slides. So I'm going to go through these slides quickly. Don't worry about it. I'll make these PowerPoints available to you on the condition that Tony makes his PowerPoints available to me. All right. So to realize that, next one, that we are nested into structures, community, individual, all these things are things we have to hold. And all these things impact outcomes, so we have to be aware of them. Next one. Universal programs do not target structures for the disadvantaged. So again, we have to think about different pathways. And the thing that's interesting is that the way we think about this oftentimes makes some mistakes. Now these structures matter. So I've been talking about race, but structures matter for everyone. Everyone. There's no one that structure doesn't matter for. So we could be talking about whites, we could be talking about white middle class folks, we could be talking about Latinos, we could be talking about gender, sexual orientation. Structures matter for all of us. So when we have a structural analysis, it doesn't exclude anyone. So sometimes I talk about structural arrangement and structural marginalization. So I don't want people to think about, I was talking to someone about this and they said, well, I'm white and I don't really deal with race. That's you know, I could say a lot about that. But the point is that these structures actually impact us all. It's not something that just affects blacks and Latinos. Next one. And we can actually talk about, next one, we can actually talk about how the structures matter along a racial axis, or along the gender axis, along the age axis. And these disparities tell us where we might focus most of our attention or where we might target. So it doesn't mean that race goes away, but it means that we talk about race in relationship to situatedness and these disparities, but also consistent with universal goals. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Okay, so in terms of language, we want to be positive. It actually matters. This is actually interesting, something I do sometime. I actually give people a sentence, and the sentence is about a person, and it has exactly the same content. Only one sentence starts with a negative, and one sentence starts with a positive. And then later in a talk like this, I'll say, how many of you like the first person, and how many like the second person? And invariably, people like the person that you start with the positive much more than they like the person which start with the negative, even though the content is exactly the same. And when you ask them why, they don't say, because you started with the positive. They say, well, Alan is better, he's warmer, he's kinder. I said, look at the sentence. It says exactly the same thing. So the point is that how you communicate becomes very important. So we talk about opportunity when we talk about these structures. You can also talk about structural racialization. They're really the same, but opportunity structures is easier to swallow than structural racialization. So I make the point that the analysis and the communication are not the same. So you have a deep analysis how race matters and how structures are racialized, but when you go out and talk to the public, that's not necessarily what you're going to talk about. We just submitted a brief in the Supreme Court and working with a whole committee, and you heard that expression that God so loved the world, she didn't send a committee. But writing a brief committee is really interesting. So some of the lawyers found some of my work, and they stuck in to put it to Supreme Court, right? And these 9 people on the Supreme Court, it's about the Texas affirmative action case. And they said, we have to have affirmative action because of structural racialization. And then they send it to me, and they said, so Professor Powell, we're using your work, aren't you happy? I said, take it out. I said, but it's your work. I said, take it out. And we had this argument back and forth. I said, describe what it is. Describe how the structure is producing these racialized outcomes, but don't label it. Because if you label it, 8 of the 9 justices will totally turn off. They won't read any further. So I want the analysis in, but how you communicate it becomes quite important. Next one. Next one. I'll go back one. So these next 2 slides basically is just saying that structures are about multiple set of relationships. It's not looking at poverty. It's not looking at class. It's not looking at ability. It's looking at all these things and how they're dynamically related. Next one. Next one. Again, we all want to get to DC. Some of us are flying, some of us are driving, some of us are riding bicycles. The pathway is different, but the goal is the same. And so we have to have something to accommodate, help people in terms of those different pathways. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. So just go back one. So part of the thing is to be aware of opportunity structures in your building and be aware of how people are situated within those structures, and then how you actually organize the structures to be more responsive to get people to the goals. Next one. One of the things, systems are adaptive. You make an intervention, the system change. So you have to actually look and see how the system actually adapts to what you're doing. You can't make a change, even if it's a good change, you can't assume it's going to actually turn out like you hope it will, because of systems are complex and adaptive. Next one. And our faiths are linked. And I have one more slide after this, but so I'm just going to put this out there. We need to create a space where you can sort of support each other, learn from each other, give each other critical feedback, but in a way that's actually bounded with civility, bounded, I would even say, with love. Justice is the public face of love. And sometimes we forget that. As I come to Oakland, people say, it's really important for community involvement. And I say sometimes there can be too much involvement and the wrong kind of involvement. Everybody has a veto. I get to hire people at Berkeley, but literally on hiring, there are 5 people that can veto a hire. It's the budget committee, there's this committee. It is hard for someone to navigate past all 5 of those posts. So I'm saying that to say the structure you're in is really challenging on some ways, and I'm aware of that, and I appreciate what you're doing. but find a way to actually support each other. If you disagree respectfully. Find a way to support your principal, your superintendent. Find a way to actually not say, I just love Tony, so therefore I'm never going to criticize him, but never compromise each other's humanity. Never forget that you're in here together for a reason. And I've raced through a lot of things, and so, next one. There's a much more deliberate discussion of targeted universalism. This is a plug for a book, so yeah. You can go online and buy it, and my grandchildren will be very happy. But anyway, it's called Racing to Justice, and it does talk a lot about targeted universalism.